Hey folks, welcome to our lecture series on the nervous system. This is a big topic, and rightly so. The nervous system is in charge of receiving all of the information our sense organs take in, and then interpreting that data, and then sending out a response. And it does this with billions and billions of nerve cells simultaneously. So let's start this series small by reviewing the types of cells that we have in the nervous system. If you remember way back to our discussion on cells, the main type of nerve cell is called a neuron. A neuron has three parts. We have a cell body, which is the main part of the cell, and that's where you'll find most of the organelles, including the nucleus. Near the cell body, you'll have dendrites, which are branching projections that receive information from neighboring cells, and then transmit that information towards the cell body. On the other end of the cell, we have our axons, which are fibers that carry information away from the cell body. At the end of the axons, we have synaptic knobs, which are these little bulbs, and we'll talk a bit more of those in a second. I think I used this analogy before, but a nerve cell is a lot like a telephone, with the dendrites being the speaker and the axon being the microphone. And the cell body would be you. The whole purpose of a neuron is to pass the information around, and we can classify neurons based on which direction they send information. If the cell sends information to a central nervous system, which would be the brain or the spinal cord, we would call that a sensory neuron, or an afferent neuron, with an A. If the neuron carries information away from the central nervous system, going to, say, a muscle fiber, we would call that a motor neuron, or an efferent neuron, with an E. If it goes in between the two, like the neurons found in the brain or the spinal column, we would call those interneurons or central neurons. So how do these neurons talk to each other? How do they send information? They do so by synaptic transmission. Let's take a look at a synapse between two neurons. That's the gap between the dendrite of one neuron and the synaptic knob of another. So when a neuron wants to send a message or a stimulus, it sends a wave of energy down its axon. It does this by pushing sodium molecules from inside one portion of the cell to the outside. Doing this causes the next part of the cell to do the same, and soon enough you get an impulse that's moving down the axon, kind of like the wave at a sports game. When the impulse reaches the end of the axon, it causes a synaptic knob to release neurotransmitters into the synapse. The neurotransmitters float out into the gap until they land on a receptor site on the dendrite of the next neuron. Hitting this receptor site is like hitting the on button, and that neuron starts an impulse to send towards the axon and synaptic knob. When the neurotransmitters are done, they are either reabsorbed by the original neuron or destroyed by some enzyme. Alright, so now we know how neurons work. Let's take a look at some of the other cells in the nervous system. These are called the glial cells, or neuroglia, which act like support cells for the nervous system. We have astrocytes, which act as anchors, holding neurons to nearby small blood vessels. We have microglia, which are like the cleanup crew for the nervous system. They travel across the brain and find inflamed areas, usually due to an infection, and clean up the debris using phagocytosis. Lastly, we have oligodendrocytes, or Schwann cells. Oligodendrocytes create a substance called myelin around nerve cells, which allows the cells to conduct more efficiently. Rather than an impulse going all the way through the axon, it can now jump across the myelin, landing at the gaps in between. These gaps are called the nodes of Ranvier. Oligodendrocytes create thick myelin sheaths around nerves and are found in the central nervous system, whereas Schwann cells create layers of myelin in the peripheral nerves. So that's it, all the cells in the nervous system. You'll find these cells in organs like the brain or in long tracts called nerves. Nerves are long lines of neurons and glial cells, covered in fat, arteries, veins, and all wrapped up in layers. So starting from the outside working in, we have the epineuron, which is a fibrous tissue that covers the whole nerve. Then we have space for fat, arteries, veins, and these bundle of nerves called fascicles. These fascicles have an outer cover called the perineurium, and inside are the lines of neurons wrapped in more tissue called the endoneurium. So recap, this time from the inside out. Each neuron or glial cell is wrapped up in the endoneurium. Then a bunch of these are all stuck together and wrapped up in the perineurium, and that's called a fascicle. A bunch of these fascicles are then put together with arteries, veins, and are all wrapped up in the epineurium. And that's what we call a nerve.